Honestly, there are 7 people I have never and will never forgive. Not just for one thing, but for a long list of times they hurt me. They know exactly who they are, and so do I. For years, Beatles fans have talked about the band's biggest fights, often pointing to Lennon and McCartney's creative battles. But behind George Harrison's quiet personality was anger so deep it would change the band's final days. Public fights, cold treatment in the studio, and one big walkout all led to a musical fight heard around the world. Now we tell you the shocking truth. George Harrison truly hated him more than anyone, and the reasons go way beyond small disagreements. Who was the Beatle George Harrison truly hated more than anyone? And why? This is the story that changed Beatles history. You don't like to talk then? Well, not really. Sometimes if there's something to say, but there's really nothing to say these days. From trusted friend to legal enemy. In the late 1960s, the Beatles were at the top of their musical success, but in deep money trouble. Brian Epstein's sudden death in 1967 had left them without a leader, and their Big Apple chorus project, planned as a perfect place for music, film, and creativity, was losing money. Even their first major Apple release, Hey Jude, a huge hit, could not hide the fact that the company had become a messy drain on money. Record keeping was sloppy. Projects were poorly checked. And in some cases, large amounts of money seemed to disappear without explanation. George Harrison, like the others, knew something had to change. And that change came in the form of Alan Klein. Klein had a reputation that came before him, both as a smart money fixer and as one of the toughest deal makers in the entertainment business. He was not a man to charm people with gentle words. Instead, he bulldozed problems, cut unnecessary costs, and squeezed record labels for better royalty deals. Harrison, who had watched years of bad management eat away at the Beatles' earnings, was impressed. So was John Lennon. Klein had contacted Lennon after reading a press comment in which John warned that the Beatles would be broke in 6 months if they kept going as they were. Klein told Lennon he could turn their money situation around, and after a private meeting in January 1969, Lennon was sold. When Klein met with all 4 Beatles the following day, Paul McCartney said no, preferring the Eastmans Lee and John, the father and brother of his soon-to-be wife Linda, to handle their business. But Ringo and George Harrison sided with Lennon, making the vote 3-1 in Klein's favor. George, who often disagreed with McCartney over creative matters, saw Klein as a no-nonsense businessman who could finally make Apple stable and protect their long-term interests. By May 1969, Klein had been made the Beatles' business manager on a 3-year contract. McCartney refused to sign, but he was outvoted. Almost right away, Klein began changing Apple. He fired staff, closed money-losing parts like Apple Electronics, and put his own people in key jobs. Though harsh, these moves were exactly the kind of decisive action Harrison felt had been missing since Epstein's death. Klein quickly proved his worth. He handled tense talks with Triumph, the new owners of NEMS, to buy back the Beatles' stake in their earnings at a pretty low cost. More importantly, he reworked their recording deal with EMI, getting much better royalty terms, an achievement that even McCartney, no fan of Klein, grudgingly supported. Harrison, watching Apple's money situation get better and revenues climb, thought these early wins proved that they had made the right choice. However, Klein's aggressive style made enemies. He failed in his attempt to take control of Northern Songs, the Beatles' publishing company, from Dick James, thanks in part to continuing mistrust between Lennon and McCartney, and he fought repeatedly with the Eastmans. Still, as Abbey Road was released in September 1969, Harrison appeared firmly in Klein's camp. When Lennon privately told Klein he planned to quit the Beatles, Klein advised against making it public. Instead, he saw an opportunity. The long-shelved Get Back project could be reworked into an album and film to fulfill the band's contract obligations. Phil Spector was brought in to finish the album, now titled Let It Be. Harrison agreed to Spector's involvement, though McCartney did not. The record and film were released in May 1970, making $6 million for Apple in a single month, further cementing Klein's reputation, at least in George's eyes, as someone who could deliver results. But McCartney's departure in April 1970 broke everything. The partnership was reduced to a Harrison-Lennon star block on one side and McCartney on the other. Paul sued to end the Beatles' business partnership, and in March 1971 the court ruled in his favor. From that point, Klein no longer managed the Beatles as a group, but he kept a role in the solo careers of Harrison, Lennon, and Starr. It was in this new phase that Harrison's relationship with Klein began to turn sour. The concert for Bangladesh was a defining moment in George Harrison's post-Beatles career. Moved by the human crisis happening in Bangladesh and encouraged by his friend Ravi Shankar, Harrison set out to organize a star-filled benefit concert at Madison Square Garden in August 1971. The event came together in just 5 weeks, featuring Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Ringo Starr, and other major names. Harrison leaned heavily on Klein's business skills to make it happen. Klein got high-profile talent to perform for free, convinced Capitol Records to offer an unprecedented 50% royalty rate for the live album, and seemed to be working in perfect alignment with Harrison's charitable goals. The concert was a musical triumph and on paper a financial one too. It raised over $15 million. But trouble followed quickly. Klein had failed to register the concert as a charity event with UNICEF, meaning the funds were subject to taxes in both the UK and the US. As a result, $10 million of the money was frozen for years while lawyers fought the case. To make matters worse, New York Magazine published claims that Klein had pocketed $1.14 from every $10 album sold. Though the numbers were disputed, the accusation left a bitter taste. Harrison, who had imagined the event as a pure act of giving, was furious. By mid-1972, Harrison's faith in Klein had cracked. What had once seemed like smartness now looked like selfishness. He was not alone. Lennon and Starr were also losing confidence. Lennon, for his part, disliked Klein's lack of enthusiasm for his and Yoko Ono's politically charged music, and by early 1973, all three had agreed not to renew Klein's management contract when it expired in March. Lennon later admitted, "Let's say possibly Paul's suspicions were right." Klein did not go quietly. He sued the 3 former Beatles and Apple in New York, claiming repayment of loans and other costs. Harrison, Lennon, and Starr Counter sued in London, accusing Klein of excessive commissions, misrepresenting their finances, and mishandling projects like the concert for Bangladesh. The lawsuits dragged on for years, during which Klein made a bold move. He tried to buy the U.S. portion of Harrison's publishing company, Harrisongs. Harrison refused. The hostility grew when Klein purchased Bright Tunes, the company suing Harrison for copyright theft over My Sweet Lord. This move meant Klein was now the plaintiff in the case against his former client. The court eventually ruled Harrison had unconsciously copied the Chiffon's 1963 hit He's So Fine. Damages were set at over $2 million, later reduced, but the sight of Klein personally profiting from Harrison's legal troubles was too much. In 1981, the court ruled that Klein could not benefit from the purchase and had to hold the song in trust for Harrison, provided George paid him back for the purchase price. The final settlement between Klein and the former Beatles came in January 1977, with Klein receiving about $5 million instead of future royalties and repayment of loans. For Harrison, the relationship that had begun in careful hope nearly a decade earlier ended in bitterness and lawsuits. Looking back, it's not difficult to see why George Harrison initially supported Klein so strongly. George had spent much of his Beatles career in the shadow of Lennon and McCartney, fighting for space for his songs and struggling to be taken seriously in business decisions. Klein's arrival seemed to offer a rare moment when George's voice carried weight, when the quiet Beatle could side with Lennon and start to overrule McCartney and take control of the band's future. In the short term, Klein delivered. He tightened Apple's operations, got better royalty rates, and brought in quick revenue from projects like Let It Be. But Klein's brand of hardball management, while effective in some ways, was also self-serving. The concert for Bangladesh Mess was a turning point for Harrison, transforming a trusted advisor into a source of deep personal and professional anger. By the time the lawsuits ended, Harrison's opinion of Klein had shifted from careful admiration to complete mistrust. Yet, even in hindsight, the picture is complicated. Without Klein, the Beatles' late career finances might have been even messier, and projects like Let It Be and the Bangladesh concert might never have happened on such a scale. But for Harrison, the cost of Klein's involvement financially, legally, and emotionally was far higher than he could have foreseen in 1969, when he first voted in favor of the man who promised to save the Beatles. Looking back at how strongly Harrison wanted to overrule Paul McCartney, what was their relationship really like? Overshadowed friendship turned tense. George and Paul had known each other since their teenage years in Liverpool, and at their core, they were good friends, but working together inside the Beatles wasn't always peaceful. George truly felt overshadowed by Paul McCartney, and over time, that frustration boiled over into both emotional and physical fights. George once admitted, I had no confidence in myself as a guitarist after spending so many years with Paul McCartney. He ruined me as a guitarist in the studio. Paul's perfectionism and tendency to direct George's guitar parts made Harrison feel terribly unhappy and creatively boxed in. But the tension between them wasn't just musical. It sometimes got physical. In 1965, while filming Help in the Bahamas, George was relaxing in a hammock when Paul decided to play a prank. He slipped a jellyfish into George's swimsuit, and the sting hit Harrison in the most painful possible place. George, stunned and furious, threw a bunch of punches at Paul's head, and the result were a split lip, a chipped tooth, and a black eye for McCartney, and a few days of George walking around with ice in his pants. The second knockout came years later, this time on the music charts. On June 30, 1973, George's single Give Me Love knocked Paul's My Love from the #1 spot on the Billboard Hot 100. It was the only time two former Beatles held the top 2 spots in the US, and George loved the victory. Despite these moments, their relationship stayed complicated rather than purely mean. They could still share respect for each other's talents, but George Harrison's frustration with Paul McCartney was one of the defining tensions of his Beatles years, and it followed them long after the band's breakup. While Paul and George shared a love-hate relationship, it was clear from a mile away that he disliked Yoko Ono. Discomfort in the inner circle. From the moment John Lennon began bringing Yoko Ono into the studio, breaking the long-standing no girlfriends or wives allowed rule, tensions rose. For George, this wasn't just about tradition. He'd already spent years struggling to get his songs noticed by Lennon and McCartney. Now, there was a new voice in the room, one with Lennon's full attention. Lennon later admitted George insulted her right to her face in the Apple office at the beginning. Harrison had bluntly told Yoko she had a bad name in New York and gave off bad vibes. Lennon was stunned he didn't punch him for it. Harrison's irritation wasn't only about music. Beatles engineer Jeff Emerick recalled a moment in the studio when Yoko wandered over to Harrison's Leslie speaker cabinet, spotted a packet of McVitie's digestive biscuits on top, and helped herself. George's eyes locked on her. As she raised one to her mouth, he exploded. That bear. It was a flash of pure, unfiltered anger. Even in public, Harrison couldn't resist small digs. On the Dick Cavett Show in 1971, Cavett casually mentioned that Yoko had once sat in the same chair George was sitting in. Harrison immediately jumped up, half joking, half dead serious. The audience laughed. Yet, despite these moments, George Harrison didn't truly hate Yoko Ono forever. Like Paul McCartney, he later said she didn't break up the Beatles. The group had problems long before Yoko came along. Many problems, folks. Time softened his view. And in the years after the breakup, Harrison even shared a respectful friendship with Yoko. But the one person George hated more than anyone else was the Beatles frontman, John Lennon. Breaking point with Lennon. It all began in late 1968. George had just come off what he described as one of the best periods of his life. He'd been in America for 2 months, far away from the tension of the band. In Los Angeles, he was producing Jackie Lomax's album, working with top American session musicians and meeting people like Delaney Bramlett and Leon Russell. Later, upstate New York brought him close to Bob Dylan and the band. George loved the friendship, the creative freedom, and the respect he got there. But when he came back to London for the Beatles' new film and recording project, what would become Let It Be, everything changed. The bad vibes hit him immediately. From the very start of the sessions at Twickenham Film Studios in January 1969, there was a problem. Paul McCartney was too bossy, constantly telling everyone how to play. John Lennon was not paying attention, more focused on Yoko Ono's constant presence than on the music. George felt his songs were ignored or criticized while Paul and John pushed their work forward. And that's when it became clear. George Harrison hated him more than anyone. Over the next few days, George brought in new songs like All Things Must Pass, Let It Down, and Hear Me Lord. They were beautiful, but Lennon dismissed them and McCartney interfered with the arrangements. The worst moment came when George brought in I Me Mine. Instead of encouragement, Lennon mocked it openly, dismissing George's songwriting altogether. For a man who had worked for years to improve his craft, it was embarrassing. The anger kept building. John's lack of contribution was another sore spot. By then, Lennon and Yoko were in their world, struggling with heroin addiction. He seemed emotionally removed and uninterested in the music. The breaking point came on January 10th. At lunch, George lashed out at Lennon for contributing nothing positive. Soon after, he walked out of the studio entirely. He told the others they could place an ad in an NME for his replacement. He drove home to Surrey, picked up his guitar, and wrote Wah Wah. It was a direct reaction to the constant interference and criticism, which he called a headache song. Years later, George confirmed that the song was a swipe at John. The next morning, Lennon and Yoko came to George's house for breakfast. If it was meant to patch things up, it failed. Lennon still let Yoko do the talking, avoiding a real conversation. George saw it as another insult. When the band negotiated his return, George set conditions. No live concert in front of an audience, and the sessions would move to Apple Studios. Lennon agreed, but the damage was done. George's attitude had shifted, and as one observer put it, he was serving out his notice. Even after returning, the tension stayed. Lennon could be charming and funny one day, cold and dismissive the next. George had seen too much to trust him again. Still, their relationship wasn't pure hatred. Years later, George summed it up with a single cutting but oddly loving line. John was such a jerk, but that's the great thing about him. When Wah Wah appeared on All Things Must Pass in 1970, it was a loud, sprawling declaration of independence. At the concert for Bangladesh in 1971, George opened the night with it. The same defiant energy that had driven him to walk away from Lennon in the first place. Yes, in later years, they would share moments of warmth again, but during that important period, the bitterness was undeniable. George had worked too hard to be brushed aside. He had earned his voice. Yet Lennon made it clear he would never be fully respected within the Beatles. In the end, this was why George Harrison came to hate John Lennon more than anyone else. Was George's reaction to his bandmates justified, or was it just rock star drama taken too far? And what's the rarest Beatles moment you've ever come across? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that like button, share it with fellow music fans, and subscribe for more untold stories from the world's most legendary bands.